Good morning, YouTube. This is Kelsey from Kels Reads Things, also known as Librarians Recommend, and I am here on this Thursday morning to discuss with you The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. Now, I will not be discussing the last book of the Throne of Glass series for probably at least a while because within the next 9 days I am getting married to my fiance and we are going to be very busy. Crazy busy. The only reason I was able to actually read this one is because I had the audiobook. But fortunately, I also own a hard copy. This is my own copy, and I was able to flip through it and kind of just remind myself of everything that's happened because it's probably been about 2 weeks since I listened to this book, maybe even 3. But overall, it was a very good fantasy novel. I guess I should mention that it's a young adult fantasy novel about fairy. Now, I enjoyed the story. I thought it was relatively decently paced. However, I wasn't crazy about a lot of the characters, and because of that, I gave it a 3.5 stars. Now, that doesn't mean that I won't be willing to finish the series. In fact, I plan to, and I actually have the second book, The Wicked King, downloaded through Libby. And for those who don't know, I think I've mentioned this before previously, Libby is a wonderful free app you can download to listen to audiobooks from your library. I can't recommend it enough. I love it. If you'd like more information about it, please feel free to email me at annaporterpubliclibrary@gmail.com or give us a call at 865-436-5588. Now, to dive into The Cruel Prince. So first, I'm going to just discuss kind of some of the themes. As I mentioned, it is a fairy fantasy. As you know, that's one of my favorite themes, especially through the A Court of Thorns and Roses series and the Throne of Glass series. But this one is a little bit different. This fairyland is a little more of the traditional fairy tales, meaning that fairies are kind of cruel to humans. They very much are tricky and riddles, and you can easily fall for glamours, and some of that is also present in other fairy stories I've read. However, the feel is just a little bit more modern, whereas this is obviously a little bit, as I mentioned, a little bit more of a classic sort of fairy story. Now, the story is told from the main character protagonist. Her name is Jude. Now, Jude is a complete 100% human who was raised in fairyland. She is one of 2 twin sisters. Her twin sister is named Taryn. And how the story begins is Taryn, Jude, and their older sister, Vivienne, were all just spending a normal, I think it was Sunday afternoon in the summertime at home. They were probably about the ages, maybe 8 or 9, and then the twins were probably, I want to say, about 7. Anyway, this cruel, wicked fairy who is a bit of a, he works for the main court, comes in and he murders Jude, Taryn, and Vivienne's parents, because we find out that Vivienne's mother was actually his wife, who deceived him previously by pretending that she burned in a fire, and at the time she was pregnant with Vivienne. So he takes on his revenge by killing the mother as well as the father to Taryn and Jude. He murders them, and he actually does the right thing and adopts Jude and Taryn and brings them back to, I want to say it's called, what is it called? Sorry. Elkheim. He takes them back to Elkheim with him. And one thing I love about fantasy novels, I think I mentioned before, is a lot of times they have a map. And something about this book specifically and this series I've noticed is it has beautiful illustrations throughout. If nothing more than just, especially in every chapter, sometimes you see a sword or a dagger just it adds a little something extra to the story, and because of that I almost gave it 4 stars, just because I like creativity and I like something that keeps me interested, and illustrations are always something I've appreciated in books. Okay, moving on. So the story opens when they're small children and are adopted by Manic, and it finally, and that was kind of like the prologue, and then finally in the first chapter we get Jude's perspective. Now Jude has decided that she is going to survive in this life. She needs to become a knight. One of the quotes I was really fond of when I was reading a synopsis about this is because sometimes I like to read other people's synopsis just to see what they thought of something that occurred, and also to kind of just remind myself of what happened if it's been more than a couple of weeks since I either listened to or read the book last. And they defined Vivi, or Vivienne, as the defiant, Taryn, the other twin sister, as the kind-hearted, and Jude as ambitious. And that is very true. Vivienne is not a fan of Manic, even though he's her father. She very much resents him from stealing her from her human life, because she's half human and half fae. But that doesn't really matter in this world. If you have any fairy blood, you are treated as pretty much like royalty, and how they treat humans in this book series is pretty abhorrent. It's terrible. It really is. In fact, they actually capture humans and feed them fairy fruit and other things that kind of, or at least fairy drinks, that puts humans in this state where they're not really conscious and they're just smiling all the time, even though they probably haven't eaten enough or had enough to drink or even rested. So humans are not well treated in this novel, and Taryn and Jude have to watch their backs constantly. Now, as it mentioned, Taryn was the kind-hearted. Taryn just kind of wants to fade into the background, and she just wants to accept her role as probably being married off at some point to some other fairy lord. She's okay with that. Jude, on the other hand, is not. And Jude is our main protagonist. It's told from her perspective. And when she has the opportunity to finally be part of the fairy court later on, she definitely accepts it, though at the time she has no idea what she's getting herself into. And that's what made the story the most interesting for me, was trying to figure out the people that she has made herself loyal to, and whether or not these loyalties were good decisions. So just to mention a few characters you should know, I've mentioned Jude, Manic, their father, who's not really their father, but he's adopted them and raises them as though they were. So that is actually something I really liked about Manic, is that he actually treats Jude and Taryn as though they are his true blood children, and he gets very angry when they're mistreated, and that happens a lot if it's not indicated by the Cruel Prince, the title. Now, the Cruel Prince, his name is Carden, and he is definitely cruel. In the beginning of the story, he and Jude are not fans of each other. In fact, he's not a fan of Jude or Taryn just because they're humans. And he and his friends mistreat them very often, except for his friend Locke. Now, Locke is an interesting character that I don't want to touch too much on, because if I do, then I'm going to end up giving away too much information. And I've been trying to avoid that in my book reviews going forward. So just know that he kind of comes in between Taryn and Jude. So we'll see what happens with that. Oriana is the quote-unquote new wife of Manic. She and him actually have a son together whose name is Oak. And in the story, Oak is a small child, and he and Jude are actually close. And Oriana is not really a fan of that. And they tend to, Jude and Oriana tend to kind of butt heads a little bit, or at least Jude is resentful of Oriana for the way that she kind of treats her and Taryn like children, and it's just mostly to protect them from other fairies. However, Jude is not a fan of how she does it or the way that she speaks to them, just not a fan. Carden, is the cruel and youngest prince of the King Eldred, and King Eldred is on his way out of the crown. He's been the crowned High Lord, High King for probably centuries at this point because fairy live forever. They don't die, of course, because what true fairy story has fairies that are mortal? I don't know of any. So it kind of, and he has several children, and I won't mention all of them, but two that you should know about are Belkane and Dane, as well as Carden. So there becomes kind of like this political power struggle in the story, and there's a lot of twists and turns, and Jude has to determine where her loyalties lie. At some point, I guess I tend to enjoy fantasy stories where specifically the main character kind of has to decide who to trust and whether or not that was a, correct decision to make, because those are the stories that I tend to read pretty often, is where there's usually a female protagonist who is strong, determined, ambitious, athletic as Jude is. I mean, her dream is to be a knight for the High Court. Like, that's what she wants to do. Taryn wants to get married and live happily ever after, and Vivian is very defiant. Vivian wants to go back to the human world. She wants nothing to do with fairy. In fact, she actually meets a human named Heather, and she starts to fall in love with her. They start dating, and she's she's probably going to eventually mention to Heather her past and who she really is. However, we're not quite there yet, so we'll find out what happens with their story a little bit later on. Okay, so again, I don't want to give too much away, but I enjoyed the story. The pacing was good. Like I said, I loved the illustrations. Jude was the only character that I really actually liked, and Manic and Vivian. Those three were my favorite characters. Vivian was snarky and sarcastic and just like very honest, and I laughed out loud, I think, at almost everything that she said. So I really liked her. Jude was a little too serious at times for me. I was just kind of like, okay, I get it. You grew up in an area where you have to be on alert and on edge at all times. Like, apparently, like, one of her dad's servants even, like, bit the tip of her finger off. So fairy are not good to humans at all in the story, and of course she has to be on alert. And then there's Taryn, who, again, as I mentioned, who became very mild-mannered and just wants to be married off and not have too much attention on them. But at the end of the story, the person who becomes the High King is not who I expected to become the High King at all, and they're actually crowned by Jude themselves. So again, that's all I'm going to give away today. Again, I gave this a 3.5 out of 5-star review. It was a good story, but I do look forward to the other installments. I'm hoping the story will just build and explain a few more loose ends that were left at the end of book 1. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to returning at some point, hopefully relatively soon, to discuss the final book in the Throne of Glass series by Sarah J. Maas. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful Thursday.